Anthony in Florida is an atheist who wants to present an argument against God. So, which God?
Well, thank you for letting me call in. It's the first time caller, and I wanted to say thank you, Matt and Paul. And I agree with you. I wish you had more atheist caller and more theist callers. But yeah, the first thing is define which God, and I would have to go with the classical definition of the Christian God, which is an omniscient, knows everything that has and will happen, and he's maximally powerful. He can't disobey logic. He can't create a rock so heavy he can't lift it. And I hear a lot of religious people. You can tell me, you can argue with me about this point that God does not change. He does not change his mind. And also that a lot of these people believe in God, believe that hell is a real place where people that are sinners are sent to be tormented eternally in pain and anguish. So that defines the God.
Okay, that's a
Okay.
lot. I mean, that's not even there's stuff there that not even all Christians believe.
Okay,
Like
which ones? Take
like hell, for example. Billy Graham and
Oh,
others
okay.
believe in or believed in annihilation theory that basically um, those who didn't believe just ceased to exist. That there wasn't actually like a eternal torment in hell. So
Okay.
there might be a little much adding that one in.
That was my big one, but okay, go ahead.
That your big one is that see, it seems like you're building up to this case that hell is immoral and is in conflict with the nature of the very God that they're advocating for.
Yeah, well, it's basically that God is contradictory. Like a lot of the stuff that they teach God leads to logical contradictions. You love people so much, but then you send them off for eternal pain and torture. But there's
Well,
other points.
the eternal pain and torture, to the extent that it happens, isn't an exercise of God's love. It's an exercise of God's justice.
Right. But he knows everything that is going to happen. That was another point. So let's go back to the Garden of Eden. And God knows when he's putting the tree of knowledge there, he knows that when he's putting
Okay.
it there and he's telling them not to eat from it, he knows they're going to eat from it, doesn't he?
Yeah, but now you're no longer talking about the God of classical theism. You're specifically talking about a God that is consistent with a literal reading of Genesis, which isn't even in the ballpark of uh,
Okay.
consistent with most Christians,
So
let alone most God believers.
a lot of Christians would say that the Garden of Eden is not a literal story. It's what would it be?
Well, William Lane Craig says it's mytho-history. It's meant to teach us the nature of how this thing came about, but not the actual events of how it came about. So it tells us how we're supposed to feel
Okay.
about it, but not necessarily spelling out that if we could travel back in time, that you could set the TARDIS down and watch Eve eat an apple.
Right. So they don't think it's a literal event. They think it's a story to
There's
illustrate.
we're just trying to say there's a spectrum. There's entirely spectrum. There's the Christianity I grew up in absolutely would affirm that if you had a time machine, you could watch Eve eat an apple or eat some kind of piece of fruit. So it's just a huge spectrum. That's the problem with pinning some of this stuff down. That's why
That's what I'm
oftentimes
thinking. I'm I'm trying to pin you guys down, and most of my points you're saying, well, not really. I guess probably the only point then would be, does God know everything that's going to happen
Depends
and will
on
happen?
who you ask. There are people who think that God knew everything from before anything, and there are people who think that God knows everything but does not know your free will actions. There's complicated answers to all of these. This is why, generally speaking, it's pointless for someone to call in and say, "Hey, I've got an argument to present against a God," because you've got the God that you're arguing against is at best a moderate straw man of it's probably somebody's God, but you know,
Well, I
you
did go
can't.
to Catholic school, and they were teaching me in Catholic school that, hell is a real place where you're going to burn forever. So, this argument goes against it. And there's lots of people I know that have had many of these definitions that God knows everything that's going to happen. And of course, there's people out there that don't, but I think a large majority of them do, and this argument goes against them. But I can understand your point of view. I'm not trying to paint a broad brush against all religions because, you know, I agreed with the first question you asked me, which is, can you define the God? And this is the God that I encounter with most people in my life, the points that they believe. And when I'm not a believer, I don't argue with them. I'm very kind and I say, that's gracious of you. But in my head, I think this is very contradictory.
So, yes, Anthony, there are loads of things, especially in like Catholic doctrine and others, that are apparently contradictory. I would argue that the concept of the Trinity itself is already nonsensical and antithetical to logic. But yeah, it's, you say, oh, I was raised Catholic, so I've got an argument against Catholic God. Cool.
Okay. Well,
I,
can I switch gears with one other thing that I want to talk to you? It's not on the topic real quick. And it's just something that I don't think anybody's ever brought up with you two or on any of these channels. So I thought it'd be interesting to
okay.
just
If you legitimately,
discussing
if
how.
you legitimately bring up something that nobody's ever brought up to either of us on these shows, I will
Well, I haven't heard it,
absolutely,
and I've
I will
listened.
absolutely be stunned. So let's do that.
I've I've listened to so many of your shows. I've never heard anybody bring this up. That is, I recently lost somebody that was very close to me, and I'm dealing with a lot of grief. And while I'm starting to tear up now.
Yep. I'm sorry.
I've thought about how atheists have a harder time dealing with grief than people that are religious. And when I went to write up some information about this person that had passed away, I naturally thought of creating a website that had clouds and blue sky. And even though I'm not a theist, I'm not a theist. I was drawn to that imagery of using that type of background to create a memoriam for this person. And I was a little bit ticked off by all the people that came up to me and wanted to bless me or invite me to have something at the church that I went to, or to try and console me, because I'm interested in believing things that are true, not things that make you feel better. And the thing that I don't know if you guys have discussed is how theists can deal better with it, how the difference in grief that theists have to go through when they've lost somebody that they love, knowing that there's no afterlife, or, as much as you can know, and how to deal with that versus how a theist would deal with that. So, is that a subject that has been brought up, dealing with grief as an atheist?
Yes, there's literally an organization called Grief Beyond Belief. It's been around for 15 or 20 years.
I, I mean, on
It's
your show,
Yes,
on your
I've
show.
mentioned the organization every time somebody calls in about dealing with grief from a secular perspective.
Okay.
Well, and then
Well,
Shannon Q has actually hosted this show. She has lost quite a bit of family these last several years, and I know at least on two occasions where she hosted the same week where she lost someone, and this kind of stuff came up. So, but that's not to belittle the topic. I mean, it's a weird
Yeah.
challenge to say, have you ever talked about this versus the seriousness of the topic? Which would you prefer we talk about? Would you prefer? Do you actually want some advice on that, or were you just doing a survey
no.
about whether?
The thing was mostly dealing with all the people that, because a large portion of the people that I know are religious, and dealing with them wanting to bless me or engage in conversations about going to heaven. You know, I guess one option would be say, I don't believe in any of that stuff, and you could just keep it to yourself. But I don't. I don't engage them in saying I don't believe this stuff. I just say, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and leave it be. But I think maybe the
Yep.
honest position would be to then engage them and say, there's no reason to believe in this guy, and start, that kind of debate. But what are you guys' opinions on that?
I'm pretty so I'm out. So if I go to a funeral, people are just probably going to know that I don't believe in any of the religious stuff or the God stuff at all. But for people who don't know, I tend to try to take their words in the spirit that they're offered, in the sense that this person is just as much an indoctrinated victim of religion as anybody else. and they are coping with an incredibly difficult situation in probably the only way that they know how. And so when they're trying to say, they say things that they think are nice things that I actually have serious objections to, but you can either push back against them. And generally, I would say, for the most part, funerals probably aren't the place to be pushing back on people's religious talk. It doesn't do very little good for the other people there who are going to be a mixed audience. You're going to start a brawl over whether or not grandma went to heaven. I'm not. Um, and the other thing is that for me, it should be about whose beliefs are prioritized. So when I die, I don't care what you do with the scraps of me. I would like for anything that's useful to somebody else, let them have it. Just carve up all the little pieces. And if there's something that's not horribly broken or whatever else, give it to them. And then after uh, you've gotten that stuff done, burn it, throw it away, sink it to the bottom of the ocean, do whatever. I don't need to occupy land. I don't need a headstone. I don't care if people. It actually would make me it feel a little weird knowing people were regularly like coming to my grave to put flowers on it or whatever else. But that's the difference: is the people who are there going there to put flowers on it. That's the way they are dealing with grief, and so while I know what my preferences would be, I'm also dead. So if you want to take this body after I'm dead and ignore my wishes and have a big open casket celebration in the biggest cathedral and lie to everybody and claim that I found Jesus just right at the end, um, that would irritate the shit out of me, except I'm dead, so it can't bother me at all.
Right. I agree with that. I think the only sticking point I had was, just them coming up to me, not at funerals, where they're approaching me or saying, "Hey, we're going to have something at the church, and we would like you to come, and it'll be about her." And we're not at the church; they're asking me outside of church. I'm like, "No, thank you." But the reality of it is like I want to tell her she was not a believer. I'm not a believer. We want nothing to do with the church, and I'm just nice. And maybe if more people spoke up about in situations like that, where they said, "I'm not a believer," and I don't want anything to do with this, people go, "Oh, there are atheists out there." But it's
Yeah,
kind of like I feel like I'm in hiding over this whole thing, which makes it worse.
that's the way a lot of atheist secularists are every day.
Okay.
And I think outside of the
Well,
funeral situation, I think you're right. If it's up to you, you're under no obligation to bear upon your shoulders the normalizing of the word atheist. But some of us need to. You're right. Some of us need to take that on, or it will never be normalized. And I think your instincts are probably right that outside of a church, especially if the person who passed wasn't a believer, I think you're probably right to at least ask the question. Well, that's interesting. As far as I know, they weren't a believer. You know, why is there something happening at church for that person? Is not an unreasonable attack, right? Like those seem like reasonable questions you could posit, or to say, well, that's not what the deceased person would think, or those all seem like gentle ways that you could at least normalize. I often advocate for the starting gradual, right? Like you don't jump straight in with Jesus didn't exist, even if that's what you believe. You saying, hey, well, maybe angels don't exist, or maybe our interpretation of this passage is wrong. You can work your way in. So those are. I'm with you. You're under no obligation to normalize atheism, but those sound like good opportunities if you are so inclined.
okay. Well, I appreciate you talking, and I feel like I've achieved something because Matt did not want to yell at me. So that's great.